It's a wondrous phenomenon that most people have never seen in person. Yet its beauty evokes a sense of grandeur. While only a fraction of its majesty is visible to the world, the deeper you explore its depths, the more you discover that its size and power are so much more vast than you ever could have imagined. When it comes to the unrealized wonders of the world, God's gracious kindness is truly breathtaking.
Well, good morning again. Welcome to our series, Flipping the Iceberg, where we are revealing the depths of God's kindness, because it truly is so much bigger, so much more breathtaking than anything we could imagine. I've got 3 kids. My youngest is my son, Corbin. He just turned 12 last month. And watching him be 12 years old has taken me back a lot to my own time as a middle school boy. In fact, here was me at 12. I was short, which is a problem when you're a middle school boy, because I don't know if you know this, but when you're a middle school boy, half of your life is spent jumping, trying to hit things that are over your head. Anyone know what I'm talking about? At least this is how it was when I was growing up. You know, the top of the door frame, the exit sign, the ceiling fan, the ceiling itself. Driving mothers everywhere crazy, you know, dirty hands touching things. And for me, though, being short, all my friends were doing this, jumping to touch things, and I was too short. I couldn't reach most things, and I would try as best as I could, but the gap was just too big for me. And so someone said, you know, if you drink more milk, then maybe you'll grow. And so I started drinking all kinds of milk. And that's when I discovered that me and lactose are not simpatico. Someone else told me that if I'd made my legs stronger, I'd be able to jump higher even if I was short. So I kid you not, I put on ankle weights and wore them under my jeans to school for weeks. Didn't help my vertical at all. It only inhibited my ability to tight roll my pants, which in the late 80s was a big problem. I mean, you needed to tight roll your pants. I tried all kinds of different things to be able to close that gap. Nothing worked. Eventually, here's what happened. I turned from 12 to 13 to 14. After the summer of my 8th grade year as a 14-year-old, I hit a wicked growth spurt, and I grew about 6 inches in 6 months. I still have the stretch marks to prove it. And then suddenly I could reach things, and I could jump and I could touch things, and I was so excited. And I went back to school my freshman year of high school, and I wanted to, you know, jump and hit things with my friends. And of course, by that point, they had all moved on from that. They didn't care about that anymore. They were more concerned with chasing after high school girls at that point. Now, in life, you will over and over and over again encounter gaps between where you are and where you want to be. There will be gaps that you encounter, and this is a normal part of life, right? As you move through life, you'll find yourself in one place. There'll be some other place that you would rather be, or you could be, or you should be, and there'll be a gap between here and there, and you won't be sure how to get there. This is a normal part of life. But so often what happens when we encounter these gaps, we don't see them as a normal part of life. We look upon these gaps with judgment or disappointment. When we see gaps in ourselves or we see gaps in other people, we tend to put a judgment on those gaps. And this is especially true, you can see this, you can feel this in the word immature. Right, on one level, immature just means you're not there yet. It means you're a 12-year-old boy who hasn't hit his growth spurt. That's all that it means. It's not really your fault. And yet when we say this word, we don't mean it innocently. We've weaponized this word, haven't we? We throw this around as an insult, as a condemnation, as a judgment. Why are you acting so immature? Oh my gosh, she is so immature. And yet here's what we're going to talk about today. Immaturity for a Christian, being immature, that is not necessarily, it does not have to be a bad word for us. Even though we've weaponized it in culture, that's not how God sees it. I want you to look with me first at Paul, the New Testament writer Paul, Ephesians chapter 4. Here's what he says. He says kind of the point of this whole thing for us is this. He says, so Christ, Jesus himself, gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers. Some of those positions, you know, pastors and teachers, some of those maybe sound different to you. But in other words, God gave us these different kinds of leaders in the church, and here's why, here's the purpose: to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God. Built up so that we reach unity in the faith and knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So the whole point of this journey is that we are to grow up together in unity and faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and we are to grow up in maturity. So you look at Paul and you kind of look at immaturity and you're saying, well, that's a problem, right? But I look at this and I see this definition of maturity: attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. I see these words and I ask myself, okay, personally, when do I think that's gonna happen for me? When is the day that I'll look in the mirror and I'll look at myself and I'll be like, well, you've done it, Dion. You have attained to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. For me, my answer is never. Not in this life, not until Jesus comes back and does that for me. It's never gonna happen in my life. And so as Christians, we live with all of these tensions. And I think that's what makes the faith so hard. And I think whenever we try to resolve these tensions in one way or another, that's when we kind of fall off and we get it wrong. See, here's the tension we're gonna live with today: that on one hand, we are forever immature. And I say forever, meaning this lifetime. We're forever immature. We will never stop facing gaps in our growth of where we are and where we could be. It's not gonna happen while you're living life in the here and now. Jesus will fix this when he comes back, but until then, we will be immature. And yet, here's the tension, yet we are called to grow. On one hand, we're forever immature. On the other hand, we are called to grow. Now, sometimes I hear people use language that sounds something like this. I'll hear people say, well, as a mature believer, referring to themselves, or as a mature Christian, and I hear that language and I always think, really? I mean, do you want to claim that for yourself? That title? I'm mature? I mean, really, are you going to say that you have attained to the whole measure, this is Paul's definition, you've attained to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ? Because if you're going to make that claim about yourself, I would like the opportunity to follow you around, for 24 hours, just to document all the ways that has not happened for you yet. See, maturity, this is a misunderstanding. Maturity in the faith is not a function of how old we are or how long we've been on the journey or how much of the Bible we know. Those things can add to our maturity, but they don't necessarily spell maturity. I can tell you, I taught for 4.5 years intensive adult Bible studies. On Sunday mornings, I would teach adult Bible study. We did special classes on Wednesday night, long Bible studies, intensive Bible studies. I taught those for 4.5, 5 years to a group of people, probably about 100, 150 people, ebbs and flows, but a consistent core of people. And over 5 years, I watched as those people got smarter about the Bible. They got better at Bible study. They did not necessarily attain to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now, in my life, the scriptures have been a part of my growth, a part of my maturing, but just studying the scriptures alone, that does not automatically make people mature. Maturity is not about tenure, it's not about age, it's not about knowledge. Paul says what it is. It's about having the full measure of Christ's wholeness. It's about a whole life. And so in this tension, in one sense, we are forever immature. We're never gonna stop encountering gaps. We're never gonna be fully grown. We'll never be able to say, I've now attained the full measure of the wholeness of Christ, not in this life at least. And yet we're not called just to throw in the towel and say, oh well, when we encounter those gaps. Instead, we are called to see the gaps and to seek to close them. We're called to grow. By the way, that's why we're called Pathfinder here. One of the things we say here at Pathfinder is that we're bringing together imperfect people who unfortunately will be forever immature. There will always be gaps in our life. We are imperfect people, and yet we're bringing together imperfect people, not just to be stuck in our imperfection, but we say bringing together imperfect people in pursuit of a whole life. We're forever immature, and yet we are called to grow. That's who we are. And while we see immaturity in ourselves and other people as an insult, God sees it as an opportunity. That's what we're gonna see today. We're gonna go to the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah, we're going there for two reasons. One reason is I keep encountering this misunderstanding, and maybe today we'll finally get the record set straight on this thing. One of the things I keep encountering is people, Christians, who believe that grace is a New Testament idea. That the God of the Old Testament was all about law and wrath and judgment, and then Jesus comes along and suddenly God is about grace. In fact, I had a conversation with someone who's long in the faith, someone I love and respect, a couple of weeks ago, and he was putting forward this idea, and I thought, my gosh, here it is still, again. This idea that somehow God's different from the Old Testament to the New Testament. We're gonna look at Nehemiah, and what you're gonna see is that God at his core is a God of grace. Grace is who God was in the beginning. It's who God is at the end. You saw that last week with Doug Moss. It's who God is in the middle. And even when God is giving us law, even when he's giving us instruction, it is because he is a God of grace. And so throughout the Old Testament, you see God as a God of grace. In the New Testament, you see God as a God of grace. And yeah, there's some law in there, and there's some instruction, and there's some hard things. We're gonna look at that today. But that is all in the context of God being a God of grace. I hope you'll see that clearly today, and you'll throw away this idea that the Old Testament God is a God of law, the New Testament God is a God of grace. Simply not true. It does not jive with what you're gonna see in Scripture today from an Old Testament book. And the other reason we're looking at Nehemiah is because probably in all of the Scriptures, for me, this shows us what God's perspective, God's attitude toward our immaturity, what it looks like, what God's response is when he sees immaturity in us. So again, Nehemiah chapter 9, starting at verse 9. Now, a little bit of context here. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, they're kind of a unit, even though they're separate books. They're part of Israel's national history. And they record this time after the exile. If you were with us in December, we did a whole series called The Unbreakable Promises of God, something like that. And we talked about this era where because of the immaturity of Israel, they lost their nation. They lost their homes. They were carried off into exile for 70 years by foreign nations, foreign invading armies. And then in Ezra and Nehemiah, that's the chronicle of them returning home and beginning to rebuild their city, rebuild their civilization. But as they do this, here's what we're gonna see in Nehemiah 9. As they do this, they stop and they take this moment and they say, wait a minute, how did we get here to begin with? And they do something dangerous. They start to look back through their national history. Now, I'm gonna give you an editorial moment. If you don't like editorials from the pastor, you can hum Jesus Loves Me Twice and I'll be over it by then, okay? Can we stop trying to erase our history, please? Can we stop, right? Can we stop trying to rewrite our history? Now, before you get too excited, I think one of the reasons that people feel compelled to do this, to try to rewrite or erase our unflattering history, is because the people of faith, Christians, have not shown the world how to do this well. Because so often in our history, when unflattering realities are brought to light for us, when we are confronted with ugly parts of our past, and there are a lot of ugly parts of Christian past, we have not always been quick to acknowledge those and to say, you know what, we can do better. We've not been willing to say, yeah, that was not good, and you know what, we can grow, we can improve, that was a gap, and with God's help, we're gonna close that gap, we're gonna be different tomorrow. We have not demonstrated to the world how that looks, and yet it's the people of faith who are responsible to show the world how to do this. See, it's our responsibility to show the world how to do this because we know a God who is a God of grace. We know a God who is gracious to us in our failures. We know a God who is a redeeming God who can take our disasters and write a better story in the end, right? We have a God who is patient and forgiving with us always. So we are the only ones who can show the world how to do this, how to look at your ugly past and not erase it, not rewrite it, but instead to acknowledge it for what it is ugly, and to say, you know what, we will grow, we will be different, we can be better because of this. Which is exactly what the people of God have always done. That's what they're doing here in Nehemiah. So they sit and they look back at their history and they go 1,000 years back. They're in this moment post-exile, they look 1,000 years back to this pattern of behavior. They start to learn from their history this pattern of behavior that existed all the way back when the Israelites were captives in Egypt. And here's what they see. This is a prayer, by the way. They're praying to God and they're recounting their history. They say, God, you saw the suffering of our ancestors in Egypt. You heard their cry at the Red Sea. You sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh, against all his officials, and all the people of his land. For you knew how arrogantly the Egyptians treated them. So the Israelites were in slavery there, they were mistreated, and so God, he came and he acted. You made a name for yourself, which remains to this very day, and here's how you did it. You divided the sea before your people so that they were able to pass through on dry ground, the Red Sea. You parted the Red Sea for them so they could escape the Egyptian armies. They could find their way to freedom. But you hurled their pursuers into the depths like a stone into mighty waters. By day you led them with a pillar of cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire to give them light on the way they were to take. You came down on Mount Sinai a short time later and you spoke to them. You met with them from heaven. You gave them regulations and laws that are just and right and decrees and commands that are good. See, the law of God is good. It comes from a gracious God. You made known to them your holy Sabbath and you gave them commands, decrees, and laws through your servant Moses. In their hunger, you gave them bread from heaven, and in their thirst, you brought them water from the rock. You told them to go in and take possession of the land you had sworn to give them, the promised land, with an uplifted hand, the land you promised to give to them. See, as they look back over their national history and they're looking for patterns of immature behavior, notice what they see first. They see a pattern of something else. They see a pattern of God's kindness to them. And they don't start with their immaturity or their brokenness. Instead, they start with a pattern of God's kindness, how God had been kind to them over and over and over and over again. See, this is important for us because when we see gaps in our lives, when we see gaps in others, when we see brokenness in the world around us, it can be so easy. It can be so easy for us just to jump in right there. But we learned something from the Israelites. We learned that no, our starting place is with the goodness of God, the kindness of God. That's where we must begin. And they see a God who starts off, before they had done anything, before they deserved anything, showing his kindness to them. And then they look further and they see how they, the people, responded. But they, our ancestors, this is the ugly part of their history, but they, our ancestors, they became arrogant and stiff-necked, and they did not obey your commands. They refused to listen and they failed to remember the miracles you performed among them. They became stiff-necked, and in their rebellion, they appointed a leader in order to return to their slavery. So they look at their history, and what do they see? They see this pattern that as a people, they are not very teachable. The word they use here is stiff-necked. You can imagine a horse or something where you pull in the rein, you're trying to get it to pull its head to turn, and it will not turn. I'm not turning, right? We may say hard-headed or stubborn. They see that they're not very teachable. And of course, they're standing there 1,000 years later looking back at their history, and they realize not much has changed. After 1,000 years, they're in this place of exile, coming home, rebuilding their city because they're still stiff-necked, they're still stubborn. They've repeated this pattern over and over and over again. So they've identified that there is this gap, right? As a people, we are stiff-necked, we are arrogant, we don't listen very well, we are not very teachable. And the moment they identify the gap, for me, I'm like, hey, let's get to work, let's fix this. What am I gonna do? What's my action plan? But before they get there, look what they focus on instead. This prayer goes on. But you, God, are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. By the way, these words here, these are words that God himself used to reveal himself to Moses. These are repeated several times throughout the scripture, so this isn't just a nice thing that we believe about God. This is what God has said about himself. I am Yahweh, God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. So if you need some words to memorize, scriptures to memorize, the next time you're seeing gaps in yourself and you're beating yourself up, like I love to do, maybe you just need to remember that this is how God has revealed himself. A forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. And because of that, because that's who you are, God, therefore you did not desert those people. Even though they tried to desert you, it got worse. Even when they cast for themselves an image of a calf, if you know the story, the golden calf. And they said, hey, this idol that we just made just now, this is your God who brought you up out of Egypt. They stole all of God's credit. and they try to give it to this idol, and they're bowing down and worshiping the idol. Even in that moment when they were worshiping a false god, and when they committed awful blasphemies, God, you didn't change. Because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the wilderness. Instead, by day the pillar of cloud did not fail to guide them on their path, nor the pillar of fire by night to shine on them the way they were to take. You gave your good spirit to instruct them, right? You kept teaching them. You did not withhold food from them, manna from their mouths. You gave them water for their thirst. For 40 years, you sustained these people, and they weren't changing much, right? Because 1,000 years later, they're still in the same place, but for 40 years, you sustained them in the wilderness. And they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, nor did their feet become swollen. In the face of immaturity within the household of God, when God looks at his people and they're evidencing full-blown immaturity, major gaps in their growth, how does God respond? With kindness. Right? They were arrogant, but he did not fail to guide them. They were idolaters, worshiping false gods, but he gave them food to eat and water to drink. They were disobedient, but he did not abandon them. See, this is what every parent knows. And even if you're not a parent, if you are an invested aunt or uncle, if you work with students or kids, this is what you already know, that you can pour yourself out for kids, you can give them everything, you can take care of them, you can be so good to them. And how do they respond? They're ingrates. Sometimes overtly, they'll just step on your kindness, and sometimes it's just that they don't know better. You do things for them and they repay you by mouthing off. You cook them a dinner and spend 2 hours cooking the dinner and you set it before them and it's healthy and it should taste good. And they're like, I don't like it. It's too cheesy, whatever. And you're like, I just spent 2 hours cooking for you, something that I thought you would like. And in that moment, I know there are moments as a parent where you're like, that's it, I'm done. You're never eating in this house again. But inevitably, what do? The next day, you're at it, you put food before them again, food that they may or may not eat. You just keep doing it, right? If you work with students or kids here, you don't abandon them because they have a rough week, they don't listen, or they're mouthing off, or they're squirrely. You show up the next week for your small group, you're still there. See, we know what it is to respond with kids. We don't let their immaturity change us. Right? We don't let their immaturity change us. We persevere in who we are, our kindness, our generosity, our open-handedness. And this is exactly how God works. By the way, this morning I even read this. There's this new book. I think it's by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, Micheline Duclef. And she talks about parenting in a calm way, and she does this research of Inuit tribes in way northern Canada and Mayan tribes, and it's really stuff I think about when I was reading this article about her book. I thought about how my great-grandmother was, about this very thing, about not letting your kids take you on a roller coaster ride of praise or yelling or screaming, but meeting their immaturity with calm. By being consistent, not letting their immaturity change who you are. See, this is how God works. Now, I used to see God differently. I used to imagine that when God saw immaturity in me, when he saw a gap in me, he was kind of like this, like, all right, Dion, come on, let's when are you gonna get it together? Time is ticking. Oh my gosh, especially when it's something that I was having a hard time getting past. And I see God this way, as this guy, because that's how I am. That's how I am with my kids. That's how I am with myself. That's how I am with people. I'm horribly impatient. And maybe that's because that's also how my dad was. I don't know. But here's what I've come to see from the scriptures, no other place, that God is not like that. Instead, God, he wants to see us grow. He is rooting for us. He wants to see us close those gaps for our sake. But he is not angry with us for being immature. Instead, he is patient with us. He keeps on being himself. Here's why this is important. Because that means the next time you encounter immaturity in yourself or in someone else, you don't have to panic. right? If God's this God, come on, what's going on? Why haven't you gotten this yet? If God's that God, then you've got every reason to panic. But God is not that God. And I'll tell you something else about panic. Panic is never the circumstance through which anyone can grow. Right? You can change your behavior in a panic to get yourself out of the panic, but you'll never grow in a place of panic. You cannot grow. Your brain cannot even fathom growth when you're in a place of panic. And see, when you can learn this, when you can learn that God is not angry, he's not impatient, he's not ready to smack you, he's not ready to abandon you, he's not ready to take away everything good in your life just because there's immaturity in your life, then instead of panic, here's how you can respond. You can respond feeling convicted but not condemned. Convicted but not condemned. Convicted says, you know what, there's a place for me to grow, and I wanna grow. I wanna get over this, I wanna move forward, I don't wanna be stuck here forever. I am convicted, I want to change. But I'm not condemned. I'm not in a panic. I'm not afraid that if I don't get my act together and soon that God is gonna condemn me or judge me or hate me. I'm not worried about being thrown outside of the love of God, because God, in the face of my immaturity, will not stop being himself. And I think that's just maybe what some of you need to hear and take home with you today. Because I know in my life, I'm encountering gaps, I'm encountering immaturity all the time, and sometimes I get in this place of panic. And panic is not a place, panic, fear, whatever you want to call it, it is not a place where you can truly grow. Instead, if you can learn to be convicted, to say, man, there's something there. I need to pay attention to that. There's an opportunity for me to move forward and to experience greater wholeness and to take hold of the fullness of Christ. I need to pay attention to this. I need to take this seriously, but I'm not condemned. I'm not afraid. I'm not terrified that God is gonna stop being good to me. See, that's when growth begins to happen. And so right now I want you to know that in your immaturity, God, he's unmoved. He's the same God he revealed himself to be, a God who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. That's who he is. You can't change him, and he will continue to be that way with you. Now, if you got that, that's important, but here's what I also want to add to that. That doesn't mean his kindness doesn't take odd forms sometimes. See, later on in Nehemiah chapter 9, they're going through their national history. I'm gonna fast forward, and here's what you'll see, that as we're getting closer to the moment that they're in, this moment right before the exile, this gap has persisted, and here's how God's kindness takes a strange turn. So you warned them, God, in order to turn them back to your law, because they were, wayward, but they became arrogant and disobeyed your commands. Surprise, surprise, they've been doing this for a long time. And they sinned against your ordinances, of which you said, the person who obeys them will live by them. By the way, that means not just if you're a follower of God, you'll live by his laws, because that's his law. But notice this, if you're a person who follows God, the reason you follow God is because you know that through his ways, we just spent a whole series talking about this, through the ways of God, that's how you find life. It's a more abundant way to live. And yet, stubbornly, they turned their backs on you, they became stiff-necked, and they refused to listen. For many years, you were patient with them. By your spirit, you warned them through your prophets. Yet they paid no attention, so you smacked them down. Not exactly. So you gave them, listen to this, you gave them into the hands of the neighboring peoples. But in your great mercy, you did not put an end to them, and you did not abandon them, for you are a gracious and merciful God. See, this can be confusing for us when we experience these moments where we've encountered a gap and we just haven't gotten the motivation to grow. We haven't taken it seriously. And so God hands us over to the natural consequence of those actions. And that's when it feels like suddenly God switched from a God of kindness to a God of wrath, but that's not true. God is still a God of kindness. See that? You did not abandon them, for you're a gracious and merciful God, but he's so kind to us that he wants to help us grow. And he knows sometimes feeling the weight of our actions is the only thing that's gonna get us there. I'll confess something to you. Back when I was in middle school, I developed the habit of having sticky fingers. You know what I mean? I'm talking about the 5-finger discount. We didn't have a lot of money, and so I learned that I could get things without having money going into a store. And I started doing this, and you know what? I realized it worked. I could get things and not have money and still get things. And I did this, and I started to become pretty good at it, I thought, because I got away with it for a long time. And so there was this gap, because that's not a good way to live, right? Taking things that don't belong to you, that's a terrible way to live. I mean, that's awful. And yet I couldn't see it for what it was, because it was working for me, right? There was this gap that I could not see, that I refused to acknowledge. I felt bad about it, but then I'd get over it. And for years, this thing started to develop in me. And then my freshman year of college, one day I was walking out of a store with some stuff that I didn't go through the cash line to pay for, and 2 guys met me at the doors, and they said, "You need to come with us." Took me to this back room. And I had to pay a fine that was like 10 times greater than the stuff that I had in my hands. Suddenly, God had allowed me to feel the weight of those consequences of that behavior, that gap that I just couldn't see, I wouldn't acknowledge. And I'll tell you, it cured me in an instant. I thought, this is crazy. This is not worth it. Why am I doing this? I was done. See, that's what God does when he allows us to feel the weight of our actions. That's what the whole exile that they're on the backside is about. See, Israel had a problem with idolatry. They worshiped these false gods, golden calves, Baals, all these false gods. They worshiped false gods until the exile. After the exile, they struggled with other forms of immaturity. They never struggled with idolatry again. And see, that is not the wrath of God, that is the kindness of God helping us grow in an area where we're just stubborn, where we don't really want to grow, we don't realize how important it is. Hebrews helps us understand this. This is a New Testament book. It says, if you are not disciplined, like if you don't experience those hard moments, and the reality is everyone undergoes discipline, but if you are not disciplined, then you are not a legitimate child of God. You are not true sons and daughters of God at all. Because God disciplines us not because he's upset for his perfection, for his reputation. God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. And God is holy, he's set apart, he's full within himself. He doesn't need us to be different for his sake. He's got everything he needs. This is for us. It's good to be like God. That's a better way to live. And of course, no discipline seems pleasant at the time when you're in the back room of the store and they're like, reading you the riot act. It's awful, it's painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. You get this? It produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Discipline is not punishment, it is training. And so even in God's discipline, what we're seeing the kindness of God, the patience of God. Otherwise, God would wipe us out if he was an impatient God, right? He'd be like, you're done, get out of here. I mean, just take us off the planet. Even his discipline is a form of his kindness. So in view of all of this, his kindness, I'm gonna call you not to squander it. I'm gonna call you instead to what is referred to as a growth mindset. See, what often keeps us from moving forward when we encounter those gaps is that we're living with a fixed mindset. Failure is a limit of my abilities. I'm either good or I'm not. My abilities are unchanging. I don't like to be challenged. So we have a fixed mindset when we see those gaps. And here's what we do. We start to defend, explain away, blame, and hide. We see the gap and we say, yeah, but that's not my fault, or it's someone else, or we conceal it, we hide it, right? That's what we do. That's a result of a fixed mindset. And yet on the other side, there's this growth mindset that says, failure is an opportunity to grow. I can learn to do anything I want. That gap isn't gonna stop me, especially because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Challenges help me grow. Feedback is constructive. When God's maybe a little heavy on me, let me experience natural consequences, that's because he loves me. That's because his discipline is for his children. So I'm calling you to a growth mindset, and here's why. Because I don't think we realize that the most important thing we can do to make our lives better is to take seriously our own growth. I'll say this again because I know right now, I look around the world and I'm like, all these crazy people, making life so hard on me right now. And there's plenty of blame to go around because the world is crazy right now. And I think, man, if these people just grow up, they'd act different, if they'd not be so crazy, then life would be better for me. And here's what I'm realizing. The most important thing I can do to make my life better, to make my life a life of peace, is to take seriously my own gaps, not focus on someone else's gaps, take seriously my own gaps. The best thing I can do to make my life better, to make my world better, is to take seriously my own growth. Now that's tough, isn't it? Because you think, well, what about all those crazy people? They really do need to grow up, and you're not wrong. But here's what you'll see. The more you take hold of the fullness of God, the more you become like Jesus, the less the immaturity of others matters. Jesus was unfazed by the immaturity of the people around him. He's walking the planet and he's fully manifesting God. He is God. And people are being immature and they're betraying him and they're lying about him. And then they eventually, the most immature thing, they inflict physical violence on him. They make up lies about him. They kill him for a crime he did not commit. And in all of that, Jesus was unfazed, wasn't he? He was hurt, he was wounded, but he was unfazed. He did not let their immaturity change him, even when immature people were doing their worst. See, the same can be true of us. If we make our own growth, not the growth of others, not worrying about what everyone else needs to do, if we make the growth of ourselves, our own growth, our number one focus. And this is something I've been practicing over the last couple of years when I'm dealing with gaps within myself. I'm a big inner critic. I criticize myself. I beat myself up. When I see when God's calling me to be somewhere else and I'm not there yet, instead of beating myself up, I say, you know what? This is an opportunity for me to grow. God help me grow. When I'm encountering challenges on the outside and I'm like, is this the discipline of God? Is this just crazy people? What is this? I don't even ask that question anymore. Instead, I just say, you know what? This is a chance to grow. When my family's gone through hard stuff and we're all going, God, why us? What's going on? I don't know that we can ever answer that question. Why are we encountering this? But here's what we say now. We say, I don't know what's going on, but we will grow no matter what. Because with a God as patient and loving as ours, how could we not? With a God who is as good as ours at our side, his spirit living inside of us, how could we not grow even through the hardest things? If God did not spare his own son, but gave him for us, how will he not also along with him give us all things? That's Romans chapter 8. See, if you're afraid of what God is going to do to you in those gaps in your immaturity, then you just need to look at the cross of Jesus to see that everything you fear, all of your worst fears, all of your worst nightmares, Jesus took those on himself. So there's nothing left for you to be afraid of. You're free from that stuff. You're free to grow. So as you face many immaturities in your life, sometimes they look like this, right? There's the gap and you don't know how to get there. Or maybe the immaturities in your life look more like this. Whack-a-mole, right? That's not me, by the way, but sometimes my life feels this way, right? It's just like one thing after another. It's like all of these gaps coming up at once. Here's what I want you to know. In your immaturity, God is patient. God is kind. And he is with you to help you grow. So instead of feeling panic, instead of feeling fear, instead of ignoring or turning a blind eye, instead of cultivating a fixed mindset, here's maybe something you can say. Where I am is okay, even though there's further to go. See, where I am is okay. There's no reason to panic. God doesn't have a clock on me. The timer's not about to run off. He's not gonna abandon me. He's not gonna leave me. Where I am right now is completely okay. I've got immaturity in my life. Guess what? I haven't grown yet. I don't know that I can do that. But you know what? That's not an excuse for me. There is further to go. And I'm serious about, I wanna go further, but right now where I am is okay, even though there's further to go. And here's what I can promise you. If you're willing to live that way and you're willing to keep growing, there's no pursuit in life that will be richer or more beneficial. You will never regret pursuing all of the fullness that Jesus has to offer you. Let's pray. God in heaven, make these words true of us. Let this become our perspective, our mantra for ourselves, that where we are right now is okay. that you look at us and you see all of our immaturities, not just a few, you see them all. And there is no risk that you are going to abandon us. There's no risk that you're gonna stop being kind to us. Even if you choose to discipline us so that we can get it, that's not about punishment, that's about your love for us. God, remind us that right now, where we are in this moment is okay, but God, give us a vision for our future. Help us to see the gaps in our life as opportunities to take hold of more growth, more wholeness, more abundance in living. And God, most of all, remind us that we are not alone. That where we are right now is okay because you're with us. And even though we have further to go, that's okay because you're with us, God. Remind us of that. We pray in Jesus. Amen.
Thank you for joining us and for being a part of our online Pathfinder community. If you're new, you can find some helpful links in the description below this video. You can also go to our website at pathfinderstl.org for those. Also, while you're there, look for our message podcasts, which is a way that you can listen to the messages on the go. You'll never have to miss any. You can listen while you're driving, while you're running, anything. So make sure you check that out. I also encourage you to like this video. That helps more people to be able to see it. Also share this video so that others can have a similar experience than what you just had. And lastly, drop a comment. The more we are interacting with each other, the more we can learn from each other and grow from each other. So make sure to drop a comment. Let us know what this meant for you. And lastly, I just want to say blessings on your week. May God be with you as you go.